This is a virtual reading of Conspirators, To Each His Own Agenda by Mag Gupta.
Chapter 22. The Steward's Tower. Now that Ignatius's project on the Citadel was complete, the building was the greatest Felthor had ever seen. The tower stretched upwards, its tip sticking up above the mountain itself. He leaned back to try and take it in, and almost tripped over his Citadel robe tail. There was one part of the surroundings which was alien to him, though. At every single access point to any part of the building and the pathways to it was a Citadel guardsman. There were a lot of them, but still only a small part of the guard. One thing that did ease his discomfort was the fact that the Citadel guard seemed happy to see him. They greeted him with more enthusiasm than he'd ever seen in his life. Many of them abandoned their posts and came over to slap him on the back and just to get a single word out of him. Alistair was drinking in the enthusiasm as well, but they weren't as far spread as the reactions for Felthor. Well, 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 a deep and partially familiar voice called out from behind the crowd. The black-cloaked men parted ranks into column formation to reveal their captain. Cameron, Felthor smiled. The man was dressed in his full Citadel Guard raiment, even his captain's helm, which he detested. Cameron made straight for Felthor, and they had a hard clap of metal on cloth. "General," Cameron smiled, "it has been too long." "It has, Captain," Felthor smiled. "You look different. You look—" He played around with his tongue. "Better." He was right. Cameron was hardly his former self. He was broader in his shoulders, and he was standing far taller than before. Even his voice had grown to include the swagger of an Italian accent, the true voice of a captain. Felthor suspected that if he had asked for something as simple as a quill and ink, or for a door to be opened, an entire room would have stopped to drink in the sound of his voice. He didn't have time to think on this, however, as his focus was brought to Cameron's close-up appearance. His previously clean-shaven face was now adorned with a carefully groomed goatee. "What is this masterpiece of manliness you've concocted?" he inquired, stroking his own clean chin. "Everything my father hates," Cameron beamed, "and thus it stays." "It suits you. You are a bearded incarnation of your father." "I'll take your word for it," Cameron smiled after a brief, awkward moment. "Your Highness," he said to Alistair, bowing slightly. "Captain," Alistair beamed, holding up his hands to tell Cameron to stop with the ceremony. "Command suits you. Your father would be proud." "Thank you," Cameron smiled, a backhanded compliment as far as he was concerned. "I've been ordered to escort you to the Citadel. The council is awaiting you." "Has everyone been called?" Alistair asked, conspiratorially. "Everyone," Cameron smirked. "Complete full house. Some of the nobles are having to stand." "Well then," Alistair smiled, "escort away." Cameron nodded. "All right, ladies, back to your positions," he shouted to the men. "Showtime's over." He and 4 other Citadel guardsmen escorted the lords across the Citadel gardens and past the fountain. The 4 wardens nodded in acknowledgement to the lords as they passed, but other than the clunk of metal, they heard nothing. "Where's General Turgon?" "Islesfield," Felthor said. "He's getting things sorted in the woodland." "Good," Cameron smiled. "The Citadel is abuzz with news that 1,000 of your men are on the way to Seaward." "Not Seaward," Alistair corrected in a bored tone, having spent most of the day rebuking the same rumours. "To my son's bastion at Ferris. We're getting the coast defensible for what's coming." What is coming? We'll find out, Alistair muttered. The Citadel guards pushed the doors open. The low, echoing rumble intermingled with the high-pitched creaking of the hinges in a cacophony of noise that almost felt like music. They walked the long walk to the other side of the throne room. The smell of rosemary and incense hung lightly on the air, and their steps rang out sharply in the silent room. The empty throne of the High King sat menacingly in front of them on its slight steps. Alistair couldn't help but stop and look at it. It's a long way up, Felthor pointed out. It's a long way to fall if we fail, Alistair sighed sadly. Well then, we don't fail, Felthor smiled. Let us go see where we stand. They went through a series of corridors and doorways until they came to the wide open space of the Citadel court. The sweet aroma they had sensed upon their entry grew stronger. Cameron was right. It was filled with people. The aromatic agents suddenly drowned out in a stench of sweat and body odor. The elderly nobles were prioritized for the seats, and the younger ones were shoved to the side in the back row. Many were still waiting at floor level with Aquila, Ignatius, Decimus, and the newly elected consuls, Camirvan, and the Ignatius's unassuming puppet consul Bibulus. There was a buzz of talk around the Citadel. Cameron laughed slightly to his friends. "Welcome home," whispered to them. "Don't get too overexcited out there." And with that, he departed, closing the door with a long, echoing bang. The buzz stopped as suddenly as a spear thrust. "Gentlemen," Felthor announced, his confident voice echoing around the hall. "Shall we begin?" No one said a word in response but simply began moving to their spaces as some Citadel guards came in to take their positions around the room. The old man, who had presided over the Citadel chairmanship for so many years, stood up, leaning dangerously on his stick. The Citadel will now hear Dictator Ignatius of House Steward. Ignatius stood up on his raised seat. "Members of the Citadel, friends," he looked at Alistair with disdain. "Family, we have achieved an impossible act. While preparing for a royal wedding, the most illustrious in history, we have completed the restoration of the Tower of Stewards. Now that we have, we must look to recuperate our losses and prepare for the future." He paused to allow a series of murmurs to go around the room. "I propose that we institute a system of taxation to increase our holdings a further 10% by the end of the spring rains." There was a series of hurried discussions around the room at this, with most of them in agreement. Alistair stood up, followed by 3 other men, wanting to be heard. The old man chose Alistair first. "Taxation, you say?" he said, looking around the room. "And who do you plan to tax? Tell me who remains in this kingdom with anything left to be taxed. I have ruled over a kingdom in my father's place for only a short time, and I have seen the result of what our current tax system has done to the kingdom. I look around the cities on my way here, and I see families driven from their homes, children forced to eat food gone black with age, men who have not seen an honest wage for over 2 years. Tax the people into submission. Tell me, when has that ever profited a kingdom?" "Perhaps the prince would rather we tax the wealthy instead," Camirvan jeered. "Perhaps we should all empty our pockets now and give this champion of the people money to feed them with." There was a chorus of quiet laughter at this. "A very good idea, Camirvan," Alistair said. "I'd be happy to take everything your family owns and give it to the people you rule over." He held out a hand expectantly. "What you have with you will suffice for now." There was a tense silence, and Alistair had made his point. "The taxation rate has strangled our realm into oblivion. We're weak when we should be strong. The Huns have returned, and we have just faced one of the largest southern onslaughts since the time of the First Exitum. Yet we are a kingdom on the verge of bankruptcy, and for what purpose? He stepped down from his place and walked onto the Citadel floor, his eyes on Ignatius. The pride and splendor of a man acting as king. What we need, gentlemen, is to lower the tax rate. Allow the people to start up their own businesses and get them trading again. Let the farmers supply their stockhouses and buy more cattle and let our economies expand. And what would you do to make up for our lack of income? Decimus asked. Where will we get the money to replace the taxes? We don't, Alistair said, threateningly. We simply take the loss. This was met with a great degree of muttering around the hall. Everyone had an opinion on this point. The Citadel guardsmen around the room had to beat their bronze spear shafts on the ground to bring silence to the hall in order for Ignatius to speak. Brash words, Alistair, he said, standing up. But you speak in circles. You say our economy should be flourishing at this time of need, but you seek to bring our finances to ruin with your words. How are we to supply ourselves for the next project our kingdom faces? What next project? Alistair demanded. What project is planned for us to warrant having such a high income? What are we paying for next? Why not simply wait and let the wounded beast that is our debts heal? We must have a surplus for an army in times of need, Aquila stated. And what armies do we pay for? Alistair protested. For centuries the treasury has refused to pay for an army, instead relying on the rich and powerful to spend money instead. He glanced quickly at Felthor, who smiled at the irony. It was this very system that was keeping them in power. The Kenshi have been suing for peace for nearly 5 years. Let us rebuild in this time of peace for when we need our wealth. For if we continue down the road the steward is setting us on, we will fall into destruction in our time of need. Intriguing words, Ignatius smiled maliciously. You speak of poverty and starvation, but that has always been the song of rich men. The mob is like a maelstrom, sucking in all around it and destroying all before it. If we give the mob a chance to have money, they will simply lose it to gambling, whores and debauchery. Better their money is in the state's purse, where something useful can be made of it. Starving people are dangerous people, Father, Decimus pointed out. People love their gold more than they do king and country. The prince may have a point. We have had a state of very high taxes for nearly 2 years, and the kingdom was fine with the lower level of tax before us. It is true, Aquila nodded. We must remember we are not talking of the full abolition of taxes, but a simple lowering of them. There was a series of murmurings around the room. Most of them were in agreement. Ignatius was not appeased. We must have a strong treasury now, he said. A strong money box now is a strong one in the future. Raise the taxes and have it done. The men around him all considered the possibility, and then the chairman stood up. The vote was taken. Unlike the trial, Ignatius had the support. The vote was in his favor. The only people who had voted against were the men most loyal to Alistair and Felthor. The man ritualistically announced the obvious fact of this, and the motion was passed. It was victory for Ignatius, and the crowd applauded him as he soaked in the glory. How wrong he was to do so, though. Alistair turned to Felthor, his face alive with a satisfied smile. Felthor returned the smile and looked over to Aquila and Decimus, who gave a polite nod to both of them. This was exactly the outcome of the motion that they had wanted, but to say so in open council would have destroyed their support amongst the lower classes. The higher taxes would allow Ignatius to continue to hoard wealth and further enrage the people, while their attempts to save the people from further reprisal would now be sung throughout the realm. Ignatius would be the villain, and, through Decimus and Aquila, they would embezzle the money they would need to raise their own forces. Alistair nodded to his scribe to make the arrangements. They would make the tax level that they wanted in the realm to allow for economic growth and create a stronger supply line for their own military. Everything relied on Aquila now. Falthor was looking eager to see if he would prove his worth and trustworthiness. The council moved to the next order of business, the movements of the troops along the South Road. Though they had evaded Ignatius by the skin of their teeth, the troops had been slow to cross the Gothic lands, and they had been seen as they crossed outside the Villum. They had orders from Falthor and Prince Alistair to move their garrison duties, which had been enough for those who questioned them, but little else. Falthor had met with them on the way to Ferrus. The army captain was a sullen man with a huge scar that went down the left side of his face all the way to his stomach. The scar had whitened his eye and taken several of his teeth. His men, however, respected him through the virtue that he allowed the men under his command more frequent access to the brothels and supplies. The captain of the legion at Islesfield was Turgon, but since he was not there, this standard captain was leading. It was his job to simply lead soldiers from one place to another. Often, in battle, they would command their companies to action, giving instructions to their sergeants. Only 1,000 men of the legion had come west, a fifth, and it was this that had allowed Falthor and Alistair to get away with deploying their troops. Though 1,000 men were still a sizable force, they was not a legionary force or an army in legal terms. The council came to an ominous hush. Ignatius was looking smugly at Falthor. "My friends, we have been taken for fools. Ex-consul Falthor has deployed nearly 2,000 men to blockade the coastal crossing from trade with our southern colonies and allies. I move that we should have him removed from the city and sentenced to life in the Citadel dungeons." "And why would you want to do that?" Alistair asked, without waiting for permission to stand. "And please tell me where 1,000 men of mine went," Falthor added, also standing. "If I've miscounted my men, then I need to find more money to pay them." The men around the court laughed. "Only 1,000 have left Islesfield." "The number does not matter," Ignatius growled dismissively, overcoming the old man's bluster of this lack of tradition. "I would have thought that you would have learnt from your trial a year past." "But the prince raises an interesting point," Camervan said. "Why has the general sent these warriors forth?" "To reinforce the garrison at Ferrus," Alistair answered, "under the command of my son Julius. He and the Swan of the Coast have been holding the coast against the pirate invaders for many months now. Falthor has agreed to reinforce my coastal defences at my request until the forces of Seaward can swell and garrison it ourselves." Decimus sighed, as did many of the councilmen. He stood up, the sound of his chair scraping against the stones silencing any mutterings. "It is true. The pirates have been plaguing our lands for many years now. The men of Ferrus have been true heroes of the kingdom. There has been many a time when those knights have saved the realm. But why not simply send in your own men to help?" "Funds and politics," Alistair answered bluntly. The royal wedding was an immense drain on the principality's coffers, and there are few men that I can call upon to fight. Any soldiers that I raise will be untrained and only be more mouths to feed. Falthor has a force of veteran soldiers, so it was a simple thing. My son has won several small victories using the superior skills of the Knights of the Seaward. Without warriors of immense skill and courage, all they would do is get themselves killed. It is a simple thing to seek the permission that is necessary to do so, Ignatius commented. Even more so with many of the councilmen who would give you said permission in your own realm at the time. Why did you not ask as you should have done? "I am still a prince of Seaward," Alistair met his gaze coldly, "just as my father is, These are my lands, and I do not need to simper and beg to guard my own realm. May I remind you, sir, Ignatius growled, that you and your realm are vassals of my rule. Then take my lands from me. Let us see how long your kingdom lasts. He held out his arms, presenting his chest to be stabbed. You can start with me if you want. Ignatius chewed his tongue. He could not touch Alistair in this regard. He was too rich and too powerful to fight. He could arrest him or have him killed. But Alistair was the people's champion and owned almost half of the land in the kingdom. If Alistair were taken away, the Greeks, led by Julius, would rise up in a massive revolt to save their prince. Both of them were hardened warriors and great commanders. It was widely said that the princes were the true men of the kingdom, and that legend would be impossible to subdue without civil war. But Ignatius knew, despite himself, that if it was civil war, he would lose, so he held back his anger and merely scowled. That is, Alistair smiled, his victory set. What I thought. The men stay with me, under the command of my son. If you feel so irked by that, then feel free to send some soldiers of your own. He eyed Aquila briefly. Aquila took the signal. Perhaps we should, he said to Ignatius. Sending our own men in would allow us to control the situation and help put aside this useless feud. Decimus agreed. Do we have a commander who could lead them? My son will lead them, Alistair said. He is the commander of Pharos, and the men answer to him, no one else. Well, let them work together, Felthor suggested. Julius will be the commander of the forces with a captain, who will be his third. Who would be his second? Ignatius growled. The Swan of the Coast, Aquila answered. His knowledge of the land and his proximity to the men will be what saves them. If we promote someone else over him, the men will simply disregard his authority. Who is to be sent then? Decimus said. There was no need to debate Aquila's point. It was widely accepted. The unassuming man, who had been silent throughout the discussion, made the point of standing. I shall, lords. As a consul of Rome, it is my duty to be where the army is. I can hear our enemies tremble already, Alistair sneered to his supporters. Sit down, Bibulus. We need a man of action. Without argument, the man sat, averting his eyes. We need a commander who is tried in combat, well known by the men, loyal to the Citadel and none other, Decimus listed, pausing dramatically on the last point, and who is local enough that they can be sent immediately. Ex-consul Tathar, Ignatius answered immediately. It was an obvious choice. He was the only other man who had been named Captain General in the kingdom in the last 5 years, aside from Feltor. There was a murmur of discontent around the floor. Tathar was a great commander in the time before Feltor had become the better man, but he had not fought for years, and rumours of his alcoholic nature were already well known. Very well, Camirvan called out. Let us contact the Captain General and bring him to us. Let us see if he is up to the task.